Howard Ross, my friend, welcome to Partnering Leadership. I am thrilled to have you in this conversation with me.
Mahan, it's always good to be with you, man.
Howard, you were one of my first guests, episode 23. And I would recommend to everyone to listen to that conversation because we focused on your own magnificent leadership journey. Now, you have an eternal source of energy, Howard, to do positive work in a field that at times feels like progress is a lot slower than I'm sure you would want to see it. So, where do you draw your energy from?
First of all, it's really good to be with you again, Mahan. And I really want to acknowledge you for getting to the stage where you're now, like what, 250 podcasts or something. That's pretty amazing. I know what it takes. Good for you. So I just want to take a moment for that. There's no question, you're right. It's not easy to do this work day in and day out. It has been for 40 years now. And I think that what it really comes down to is something that I talk to clients about a lot, which is I think one of the things that helps me sustain myself is that I try to keep my eye on what we're trying to build together. So, like the title of that old wonderful documentary, Eye on the Prize. For people who focus mostly on fixing problems, it's very easy to burn out. And clearly, we have to fix problems in order to build a future sometimes. But it's so important for us to keep our eye on the future and what that future could be. And for me, that means building a world for my grandchildren and for their children and their children. And when I focus just on myself, I could very easily lose energy. But when I focus on my children, my grandchildren, my great grandchildren, then that is a whole nother conversation.
That is so beautifully put. You have that purpose that has driven you all through the years. Now, you've been a thought leader in the
Yeah.
space, Howard, with different books, including Everyday Bias and Our Search for Belonging,
Mhm.
how our need to connect is tearing us apart. And you open up Our Search for Belonging with a quote by Dr. Maya Angelou, who,
Mhm.
"You're only free when you realize you belong no place. You belong every place, no place at all. The price is high. The reward is great."
Mhm.
What is the significance of that quote and what does it say to you, Howard?
For me, the way I hear the quote, and of course, we're always interpreting other people's words. I'm not saying she meant this, but for me, what it meant was there's this dance that we do in our desire to belong, which I postulated in a book, and I'm not the only one, is our core human need, this need to fit in with people around us because we're essentially social animals. And that is this desire to be part of something, to be part of a group, a clan, a family bigger than ourselves, to fit in, to feel like we can be fully ourselves. But the irony is, the interesting contradiction to that is that the only time we can really fully belong somewhere is when we're also completely comfortable being ourselves. It's, you know, that the times when you're in the greatest sync in your relationships is when you're fine without them, but you choose to be in them as opposed to needing them. And I think that the quote from me really speaks to that. We have to work to develop our own sense of belonging in the world, and at the same time, to work with the way we interact with other people. And it's only when we're doing both of those at the same time that we really get that sense of wholeness.
And you mentioned that belonging might even be more important than survival for many of us.
What we're finding out now through not only social science research, but also cognitive research and studying the brain and watching how the brain responds under functional magnetic resonating imagery and the like, is that belonging is our fundamental human need. And it makes sense if you think about it, Mahan, because what's the most vulnerable time of a human being's existence? Infancy. The newborn baby will literally die if it's not taken care of. And whether it's mom or dad or grandma, grandpa, or the orphanage, somebody has to be taking care of that baby. And so the first imprint we get, and in humans it's probably longer than any other animal on the planet, is that we cannot survive without them, without who they are. That I need you to exist. I need somebody else to exist. And so we know when we look at the brain, for example, that being excluded from a group triggers activity in the dorsal posterior insula of the brain, which is the same part of the brain associated with physical pain. So we've way undercalculated the impact of this. And it's important for us as we move forward and try to heal our society to realize that creating space for people to belong rather than being in these oppositional tribes is what we're going to need to do if we're going to get past this difficult time that we're in.
So, why is this desire for belonging tearing us apart?
Robert Putnam, who's a sociologist at Harvard and wrote a book, I'm sure a lot of our listeners have heard of his book, Bowling Alone, which he wrote back in 2000, huge bestseller, and considered to be, up to that point, the seminal study of social capital in the United States. And what Putnam found was that there are different ways that we connect with the people around us, that some of us have these bonded relationships where we're part of something that we almost co-identify with. It could be a family. Sometimes it could be an ethnic identity we bond with, or some other identity. It could be a book group that we've been part of for a long time, or a group that you had in college who every year for 30 years you still get together with. But there's a tight bond there. And these relationships are generally pretty immutable. You got to do a lot to break those relationships. It's not to say that they can't be broken, but very difficult to break them because we so co-identify. But our social capital really expands when we bridge to other groups, and when we bridge across our bonded groups and we expand from those groups that we're so naturally tight in. As we do that, as we make friends from different racial groups, different gender groups, different areas, regions, sexual orientations, generations, this is how we really expand our social capital. The challenge is that what's happening now is we're being pushed into these bonded groups, particularly politically, although the political groups we're in also align with things like racial identity, because we know, for example, that the percentage of white people who vote Republican is dramatically higher than Democrat, and the percentage of Black people who vote Democrat dramatically higher than Republican, just as an example. And so as these groups become more bonded and less capable of bridging, we then have to make the choice, which team are we on? And so we end up getting this division because we can't be without a team. It feels uncomfortable for us to be without a team. And this is, of course, what we hear from a lot of people who see themselves as moderates now politically, as we've gone from a bell curve society to a dumbbell curve society where everything's on the end and nothing's in the middle. And so as a result of that, the need to bond, the need to be part of these tribes that we're in is pulling us apart from each other.
And that's a challenge, Howard, that I hear from organizational leaders. And I wanted to touch on a couple of different aspects of it. One having to do with politics, and the second one having to do with that sense of belonging within the organization. On the political side of it, a few days ago was with an organizational leader, CEO, who said, my people are wanting me to speak up with the smallest thing that happens in the community. However, we have different stakeholders. We work with the federal government. We need to be mindful. I'm not the spokesperson for a social movement. I'm the CEO of an organization. So the sense of belonging that my employees have is to one of those groups that you talked about, and they want me to speak up every time. How do you see CEOs, leaders of organizations and teams being able to balance what is the desire for their employees to belong and advocate on behalf of one group while they see the interest as being broader?
I think it's challenging. And frankly, I have compassion for CEOs who have to face that challenge because it's so difficult when we make these decisions about where we want to stand, what we want to stand for, that we know that in a society in which almost everything has two points of view. But I think that at the same time, we have to be really careful not to create false equivalencies where values are concerned. And this is what the distinction is when I work with folks and have these conversations, saying, look, I don't care where your politics are. The question is, what are your values? For example, let's say when Target decides to take a position to have gender neutral bathrooms and they face challenges in the community, people who don't like that, the response is, look, we don't care about the politics. We don't care whether you're Democrat, Republican, or liberal or conservative. We just stand for the right for our employees to have a place where they can safely go and use a bathroom and be recognized in the identity that they want, because it's a value of ours that our employees should be treated with that kind of equanimity, that kind of equity, that kind of equality. It's true that you will lose some people. And I think anytime we take a value position as an organization, we may lose people. Look, we can lose people because we raise the cost of an object because it costs more than somebody wants to pay. But I think ultimately the kind of organizations that maintain their cultures that invariably perform at the highest level, organizations have a clear set of values that they're willing to stand by. and they're willing to stand by even in the face of sometimes public criticism. It's a very challenging thing to do, and I'm certainly not in a position to prescribe what anybody has to do. I think that the other piece of it that you speak to is an important one, which is how do you deal with your employees in a circumstance like that? And I think that requires deep engagement, really giving people a chance to have an internal place where they can share their ideas, feel respected by listening from those ideas. But a leader still needs to be the one who makes the leadership decisions for the organization. And even when some people don't like it. The first time I took over running an organization was many years ago when I was teaching, and I was asked to take over leadership as an executive director of a nonprofit school I was teaching in. And I didn't know anything about leading at that point. I was maybe 27 years old and I barely knew anything about leading. I was struggling a little bit and made the same kind of mistakes a lot of people made. Somebody would come to me with a problem and I'd say, sure, go ahead, do that. And then somebody else would come in and say, when they did that, it did this. I said, go back and do the other. And pretty soon nobody liked me. So I was talking to somebody who was an elder to me at that time. And she said to me, listen, and she was referring to Casey Stengel, the old manager of the New York Yankees who won more championships than any other baseball manager. And she said, Casey Stengel used to say that on every team he ever had, a third of the people like you, a third of the people don't like you, and a third are in the middle. And the key is to keep the third who don't like you from the third in the middle. And it's a little bit simplified, but the truth is that it's life. Sometimes people are not going to agree with you. You got to do what's right. And I would just suggest we don't want to make these decisions based on who we're going to make unhappy. We want to make these decisions based on the values of our organization.
That's a great perspective to have. If it aligns with your values and the organizational values, decide based on that. Now, within the organization, belonging is also critical to psychological safety. I've also had a conversation with Tim Clark. He's done a lot of great work and written books on psychological safety and talks about that need for belonging. One of the challenges that I see is that within the organization, there are subgroups where people don't feel a sense of belonging. So, how can organizational leaders think about how to get everyone to feel a sense of belonging to the organization?
There are a number of things we have to do. First of all, I think it's really important for people to have a clear sense of direction in the organization. What are we trying to build here in a deep and substantive way? Not just we're trying to make money or vision statements, which are great. I have no problem with vision statements. We're trying to be the best this or impact that or the like. But I do think that what we often do is we don't articulate clearly for people what kind of a culture we really want to have. What does respect mean in our culture? What does access to communication mean in our culture? What are we trying to build together? And as I said earlier, that's what really inspires people. And so I think having a clear sense of that is really important. I think a second factor is to have structures created that allow people to have their voices heard on a regular basis. That can be done lots of different ways. I know a lot of people now who are doing quite robust online communities where people are engaging on a daily basis, even though a lot of their employees are still working remotely and intend to continue still working remotely. Having a structure for how do we deal with conflict when conflict comes up in our organization. So rather than being afraid of conflict, we know that when conflict comes up, we naturally go into dealing with it in a particular way and gives us an opportunity to do that. But most importantly, I think that people need to be involved in decisions that affect them. And that doesn't mean that they get to have their way every time, but it means they do get to be involved in decisions that affect them, that their voice matters, that their voice counts. And I think as leaders, there are lots of ways that we do that by getting out and spending time listening and really getting a sense of what it's like for people in the organization, how they're feeling. I think that trust is to human relationships like energy is to physics and cells are to biology. It's the basic currency of human relationship. So anything we can do as leaders to build trust plays a huge role in creating that sense of belonging and staying ahead of things too. A lot of times we have a tendency, and I think this is true for human beings in general in life, not just in organizations, we have a tendency to kick things down the road a piece if we can, not deal with them. And then we wait until they become big problems, a chance to resolve before they become issues that are really big for us to handle.
Howard, you mentioned that the listening and that engagement with people, one of the issues that a lot of organizations have been having is many of the senior executives feel like there isn't as much of a sense of belonging with people not spending time in the office. So they want their people to be in person in the office more. There's a lot of resistance from employees. So, how would you recommend for leaders to approach that And is it easier to have a greater sense of belonging to a group and organization when people are in person?
Human contact matters. Being able to see each other, touch each other, the casual conversations that happen. We're all Zoom fatigued. One of the things that we've really lost are the casual kinds of conversations that happen in between. When you're walking into a hallway, you run into somebody, you say, you have a brief conversation. Hey, you know anything for lunch? Let's catch lunch together, or let's get a cup of tea together, or you're sitting around for 10 minutes before or after a meeting. Those kinds of things do matter. And I think a lot of organizations are moving to some kind of a hybrid arrangement for that reason. In the early days of the pandemic, there was a lot of stuff that was coming out that was showing that people were actually being quite productive staying at home. But the current research on that is much less clear. In fact, there's some evidence that there's some very non-productive kinds of jobs. And I have to say, just anecdotally, not long ago, when I was talking to a couple of early 30-somethings who were living in a group house, they both work from home. And I said, what's it like? She said, we love it, man. It's really great. One of them was an attorney and one of them worked in the music business or something. And said, we're really good. So we get our work done by 1 o'clock. We have the whole rest of our day for ourselves. And I sat there and I said, so if you were in the office, what would you do at 1 o'clock? And they both, the blood drained from their face. And they both said, well, I guess we do other work. And I think there's a lot of that. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's no question that people are using substances more while they're working when they're at home. There's no question that people are doing other things when they're working at home. They've got music or TV on or all this other kind of stuff. So to say that we're functioning at the same level, it just doesn't seem realistic to me. The other side of it, though, are there are some jobs, for example, some tech jobs where people spend their whole day just sitting looking at computers anyway. In those cases, why not be at home? There's no reason people come in. I think people have to make these determinations based on their own cultural environments and the nature of the work that they do. I know the smartest leaders who I've been talking about this do basically what we've talked about before. They get people to give them feedback and input. They put together teams to come up with suggestions for them. So what they come up with then represents some work that the organization did with the input of the organization, and people are likely to receive it. And then I have other people who say, we just ask people to come in 2 days a week. And some people who got hired during the pandemic said, that's it, forget it, then I'm leaving. And these are some of the decisions, like I said earlier, some people aren't going to like it. Then you have to say, oh, are we going to change our whole system just to keep this person in the organization? Maybe they're going to have to leave then, which is too bad. But again, we have to make the decision that's right for the values of our organization. And if you believe that having people together every once in a while is good for the culture, that's a value.
I love the way you put it, Howard. Look at the values, ask whether it's the right thing for the organization, get people's engagement, and then make a decision and move on. Not everyone is going to agree
That's
and
right.
like it, but as long as it's aligned and you go through the process correctly, you give a best chance for people to feel that sense of belonging and engage. I also agree there is a special element in those in-person experiences. So I had a conversation with Vanessa Bonds. She's a professor of organizational behavior at Cornell, and she's done a lot of different studies and quotes other studies as well. Her book is You Have More Influence Than You Think. And she shares the example and a study where when people are in the same space, even without seeing each other's faces, when they taste chocolate, let's say bitter chocolate, the sensations are more magnified than if they are not occupying the same space. So
Mm.
we don't exactly know what it is about humanity and two people occupying the same space, feeling a certain connection to each other that doesn't get duplicated with the technology. So in person helps with that sense of belonging.
There's no question about it. No, when we did the research for our search for belonging, we had lots of studies that showed, for example, they do these pain studies, and the way they'll induce pain is by putting somebody's hand in ice water. So it doesn't harm them, but it causes pain. So it's a good way to do that. And then they'll say, from a scale of 1 to 10, how much does it hurt? And let's say the person says 9. So when they do it by themselves, they say 9. Then they say, okay, do this with a loved one. Let's say you and your wife do it together. Now the same person, same experiment says only 5. It doesn't hurt as much when I'm with my loved one. We also know, for example, that the Greater Good Science Center out at Berkeley just a few months ago came out with a study that shows how much little engagement makes a difference in human happiness. That, for example, when you pass somebody on the street and you say good morning, instead of just walking by them, you get a little hit of oxytocin. You get a little hit of that positive hormone in your body. When you help somebody, when you're on an airplane, you help somebody lift their baggage up, or stop to help somebody change their car, or pick something up for somebody. All of these little tiny activities, we've all seen those bumper sticks or random acts of kindness. Well, it turns out that these random acts of kindness increase our level of happiness, lower our blood pressure. And when we don't have those opportunities, when we're sitting here looking at screens all day and don't have those opportunities for those little micro engagements, we also lose that. It's not just the big engagements, it's the little things that you're talking about. Being with somebody, seeing somebody, just having human presence around us makes a huge difference. So I don't mean to sound also like a Luddite and say we need to go back to the old days of everybody working 9 to 5, 5 days a week. Of course not. But I think we need to find the middle ground that still allows us to have that human contact, even while we are using technology in a way that is more efficient for certain people, and especially people with family situations with children or elderly parents at home or long distances to travel or things like that. So it's not an all or nothing. And I think that's a good lesson about a lot of the stuff we're talking about, is that we have too much of a tendency to see these things as binaries rather than things that we can work with nuance.
In your book, you talk about the 8 pathways to belonging, Howard. I wanted to touch on a couple of them. The third one is personal connection, vulnerability, and consciousness. What is the right level? How vulnerable should you be?
We've created structures and organizations for generations. This notion that the person who comes to work is not the same person you are outside of work. Meanwhile, we know that there are people who have all kinds of things going on in our lives around us. We have no idea what's happening. It affects people's performance. We have no way to help them. I remember years ago having somebody in our company who had been an excellent employee for about 7 years. And then she went through a period where for several months her performance just dropped through the floor. And one of the people who leaders of the company was pushing on me to fire her. And I said, we're not going to fire her. We're going to find out what's going on with her. Because at first she was resisting sharing anything. Finally, I took her out to lunch one day, and we'd known each other for many years. We had that come to truth conversation. And I found out that she's being abused at home by her husband, who's also cheating on her. What did we do? We got her help. We got counseling support for her. We found a safe place for her to go. Ended up being a good employee until years later she left for an appropriate reason, because she was taking on a different profession. That's obviously a pretty dramatic circumstance. But the truth is, my experience with working with people over the years was the more I was willing to be myself, first of all, the more people were willing to be themselves with me. And secondly, the more people were willing to be themselves, the more honestly we could deal with things that were going on around us. And I think the best tool that I can think of for doing this is storytelling, sharing stories. One of our consultants went out, when I was still running Cook Ross, went out years ago to a United Way in the Midwest. They had a circumstance where there was a scandal and the CEO got kicked out and they had to replace them, and the whole place was a mess. And he got there and he just realized that these people didn't even know each other because there were new people. So he said, here's what we're going to do for this session. All we're going to do is everybody choose a partner. And they took, I think, 20-minute intervals is the way he did it. And they spent 20 minutes with a partner, each taking 10 minutes to tell their story. And then they chose another partner, did it, and then another partner. And they did this for a few hours and got it going. So each of them got 7 or 8 different partners. Then he went away, came back a month later. They had been so taken by it that they had spent the whole month doing this in the organization. Every lunchtime, somebody had somebody else to share stories with. And just by doing that, the organization had started to heal, just by knowing each other. And so I think it's really important that we get that. That waitress who is impatient, we don't even know that she's got a child who's sick at home. There's that wonderful story. I know you've read probably Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits. And there's a wonderful story he tells in 7 Habits when he's on a train in New York City at Subway. And this guy gets on with his children, and the children are running around wreaking havoc and pulling people's newspapers. And the guy's just sitting there staring straight ahead. And Covey finally says, aren't you going to control your children? And the guy says, we just left the hospital and her mother died, and I just don't know what to do. And he said, at that moment, I went from frustration to compassion. And I think that that's the kind of listening we need to do with the people around us, to recognize that we share so much in the way of the challenges we face and in the way of what we want for our lives and for our families' lives. And when we really talk about that, when we really share what we're up to in our lives and the challenges we're facing and the objectives we have and the goals we're setting, then we begin to see our common humanity in a very clear way.
That's a beautiful way for us to help that sense of belonging by becoming better ourselves and working on ourselves. I love that, Howard. And that storytelling is really powerful. It also connects with point number 7, honoring narratives and the power of language. So, how can narratives be honored in an organization in a way that doesn't?
Going in with that understanding is an important piece of it, to know that there isn't one way and that people can respond differently at different times, and to be listening to, is this working for you? Do you feel like you have an opportunity to be heard in this system? The thing about narrative that's so important is not just because it's some touchy-feely thing that makes us feel good, but because it gives us a deep understanding into people's motivation. Leslie and I, my wife and I, used to argue by keeping the window open at night in the bedroom because she wanted it open and I didn't like it open. And for a long time, it was, I want it open, I want to close, I want it open, I want to close. And then finally, it did take us long, fortunately, but we sat down and said, why do you want it open and why do you want it closed? She wanted it open because she likes the fresh air and she gets a little bit warmer at night, so she likes the cool air. And I wanted it closed because I get a little bit colder at night and because the noise bothered me. So once we realized the reasons, it was pretty easy: earplugs and a heating blanket, and it's handled, right? But until you get to where people are coming from, you don't understand that. And I think that's the thing that's really important. If you have people who feel like, this way of sharing narrative is not speaking for me, then the appropriate question is, great, tell me why and tell me what we can do to have it resonate with you. But I do think that it's really important for us to understand the power of narrative in the human experience. And there's a wonderful anecdote that was Gregory Bateson, who was Margaret Mead's husband and a noted anthropologist in his own right, in one of his books back in the 1940s, had this story. And he said they were trying to create the first computer that actually thought like a human being. And so they did all this work on it. Finally, they pressed the button and the wheels turned and everything happened, and it spit out a little piece of paper. And on the piece of paper, it says, I have a story to tell you. And Bateson says, then we knew it was actually thinking like a human being, because that is the way we approach life. We think in terms of stories. We relate things to the stories of our lives. When I look at a new situation, I guess what's going on in this situation based on what's happened to me before. And as my friend Sukhvinder Obi, who heads the Brain, Body, and Action Lab up at McMaster University in Toronto, says, the brain was designed to be good enough most of the time. The human brain does a lot of guesswork based on, is this situation similar to that last situation? So the more in-depth stories we have about people, the better sense we have of being able to connect and relate to that and connect and relate to each other.
That's a powerful point that you make in that sense of belonging. I had a conversation with David McCraney. He has an outstanding podcast, You Are Not So Smart, and a great
Mm.
book, How Minds Change. And he shares a lot of different examples, including the example of when kids are given different color shirts. All of a sudden, the people who are the green shirt ones don't like the ones that are red shirt ones.
Right.
So we do go through those exclusionary thoughts. We do connect with people of similar backgrounds, similar experiences. But that power of narrative that you talk about allows us to connect with and understand and have common grounds with more people than we would immediately have based on the surface interactions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Howard, the other thing I would love to get your thoughts and perspectives on this sense of belonging and the issues in organizations is there are people like Jonathan Haidt that talk about a couple of different things. Part of it is the social media and the impacts that those things have had. Part of it is he says that we have lost the ability to have conversations because we are very quickly offended and we've become more fragile. I would love to get your thoughts on that. And how can we then have better conversations, including in organizations?
I have a tremendous respect for Jonathan Haidt's work. And I think that he points to something really important, which is that we're developing a culture on which people are so worried about being safe that they're forgetting how to deal with difficulty. And this is why I often say to people, I'm not so interested in creating safe spaces. I am in creating brave space. The ability people lean in. When I was growing up, now mind you, I'm 72 years old, so it's been a while. When I was growing up, you had to work things out for yourself on the playground and the like. I'm not saying it was always great, because a lot of times that meant that bullies left without control and stuff like that. But we've now gone to the opposite extreme, where anything some adult swoops in to resolve, or extreme trigger warnings and not being able to speak about subjects and all of this stuff. And of course, there's some of that happening on both sides of the political equation. I think I'm far more concerned about the book banning and stuff that's happening on the extreme right than I am on the fact that people are uncomfortable about certain conversations on the left. But both of them are problematic to a certain degree. And I think what ends up happening is you raise a society of don't know how to deal with difficulty because they never had to learn to work things out on their own. And as soon as somebody disagrees with me, my solution is get them away from me or make that disappear, as opposed to learning how to deal with it and learning how I'm reacting to it and why I'm reacting so strongly to it. And so it is absolutely a challenge. And I think that we have to come to terms with creating structures that help people feel safe enough to engage in a little bit more controversy. And there are some great organizations who are doing that out nationally, politically. There's Braver Angels is one organization that's doing that. I think there's a No Labels organization. There's something called Operation Respect, which I know Peter Yarrow from Peter, Paul, and Mary is playing a big part of. And there are lots of organizations that are out there doing it. And even some people in the DC area who are just sponsoring dinners, bringing people together. But I think that we really need to get past this notion that just because somebody disagrees with me, they're not worth talking to. Yes, there are extremes in both cases. I'm not saying that if somebody said to me, would you take on trying to convince David Duke not to be a racist? I would say, why would I bother wasting my time? He's attached his identity to it. It's no longer a point of view. It's now his identity to be a white supremacist. So I'm not going to waste my time with that. But if you talk about somebody who's on the other side of the political spectrum, who's, let's say, a Romney Republican, just to take a name out, of course I talk to that person. And I may even learn something from that person. I may even learn something about my own perspective. So I think we've got to get out of the binarization of these differences and realize that we're really on a continuum. And there always are people who are on the other side of a politics who we can still reach and talk to.
So, in order for us to do that, Howard, post George Floyd's murder, there have been a lot of conversations in organizations where there were anti racist statements and initiatives. Some started and have gone well, most have sputtered out. What, from your perspective, needs to happen on an organizational level for us to continue the movement and have a greater sense of belonging and that inclusion in the organization where everyone, regardless of background, ethnicity, gender, feels like they can be part of creating that better future together?
Yeah, it's true. What you're saying is true post George Floyd. Unfortunately, we're an instant pudding society. We like quick solutions to things. And so a lot of times we're very reactive. So George Floyd got lynched, and then all of a sudden people took all these big positions without even thinking what it would be like or what they needed to do to play it out over time. And then, of course, we get the counter, the pushback, the anti-critical race theory and all that other nonsense pushing back. And it ends up being the sort of windshield wiper. Now, I do want to call out there are a lot of great organizations that have sustained those efforts. Capital One is one here in the DC area. This is some remarkable work in terms of training its leaders relative to racial equity in these kinds of issues over time. And they've stayed with it. There are a lot of other organizations similarly who have really stayed with it. And I think that there are a couple things about this. I think, first of all, we need to realize that being our word is more important than having the popular thing to say. And saying something because it's the popular thing to say or do, if you have no clear intention to be your word, only will set you up for greater failure. Because the people in a lot of these organizations, I know because I talked to them, are more frustrated than they were before George Floyd because people made false promises. Now you've made a false promise, you've upped people's expectations. I think that we need to think strategically, just like anything else we do in business. You don't just say, all right, we're going to treat our customers better. Go do it. What are the chances? You've seen all these efforts. You know how they're like rain dances. It's like a rain dance. We're going to bring in the rain dancer and that's going to somehow change the weather. It's just as opposed to, all right, let's be very thoughtful. How do we take a culture change approach, a change management approach to looking at what are the structures and systems in our organization that are going to have to be changed to make this sustainable? What's the communication strategy we're going to develop? Will we need some education as a part of it? All of the different components. And when we put that strategy in place and then put an accountability system in for how we're measuring whether or not they're working, I think that's how you create change over time. And that's where people who've been doing it in a sustainable way, how they've been approaching it.
And you've done a great job in making sure that you are a vocal advocate and help organizations in that journey. Because I think it requires people that sometimes also hold up the mirror to the leaders and the organizations and
Yeah.
challenge their thinking that there is more progress to be made and help guide them in that direction. And you've done a magnificent job of that with lots of different organizations, Howard.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
So, Howard, in addition to your own books, what resources would you recommend typically for leaders as they're thinking about both how to create a greater sense of belonging in their teams and organizations and to be able to tackle the biases that exist as they want to have a more inclusive team culture?
There's so much out there these days. In terms of leadership thinkers, one of the people who I respect the most is Ron Heifetz, who's at the Kennedy School at Harvard, who's just, I think, a brilliant leader. I'm sure you're familiar with. He's often at the top of my list when people say, can you give me somebody to look at leadership? Because Heifetz really emphasizes adaptive leadership. And I think that's what we need at this time. There's some great work on bias out there. There's two colleagues of mine in the diversity space, and Michael Barron did a great book on looking for how bias shows up in small activities. Mesrin Banaji and Tony Greenwald. Banaji is at Harvard, Greenwald's at University of Washington, did a great book called Blind Spots about bias, and they were the developers of the implicit association test, which I'm sure some of the folks listening will have heard about, which is the major test in that regard. But I think that one of the great things nowadays is you can also just look through TED Talks. There's just some amazing thinkers, Simon Sinek's work, and some of these other people who are out there who are just brilliantly, I think, pointing us in the right direction, how to think about some of these things newly.
There are great talks, great books, and great conversations with Howard Ross as well. There's a favorite podcaster of mine. He has a tongue-in-cheek, funny way of saying, he says it's a dumb time to be dumb. His point is there's so much great content out there. If you like watching videos, there are lots of great videos. If you like reading, lots of outstanding books. And if you like listening, lots of great conversations to listen to. So, Howard, how can the audience find out more about you, connect with you and your books?
The books are all available on Amazon and like. My current company is called Udarta, Udarta. It's actually the Hindi word for generosity and compassion. So I can be reached at howard@udarta.com. And I also have a website, howardjross.com, that people can find me at.
For someone who has known you for more than 25 years, you embody generosity and compassion. And I don't think you could have picked a better name for your organization, Howard Ross. I really appreciate this conversation. And most especially, I appreciate that for 25 plus years, you have helped open my eyes, help me see opportunities in the community, help me see a future potential for our organizations and for our society. Thank you so much, my dear friend Howard Ross.
Mahan, I'm so touched by your words. Thank you so much. I really deeply appreciate it. It's always great to be with you.